The train from St. Louis smelled like coal smoke and damp wool, and Eleanor Hart had been sitting in the same seat for 11 hours without once looking out the window. There wasn't much point. Everything outside the glass was flat and brown and endless, a landscape that seemed designed specifically to remind her how small she was, how little any of it mattered. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her travel bag wedged between her feet, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance somewhere between the seat back in front of her, and wherever it was, people went when they didn't want to think anymore. She was 27 years old. She had $42, a one-way ticket, and a letter of recommendation from a church minister back in Cincinnati, a man she barely knew, addressed to a boarding house in a Colorado mountain town called Dunmore. That was everything. 18 months ago, everything had meant something different. 18 months ago, everything had meant her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, the smell of biscuits, and the sound of her brother Thomas arguing with someone about something that never quite mattered as much as he thought it did. It had meant a teaching position at a school 2 streets from where she'd grown up. It had meant a life that was small, maybe, and unremarkable by anyone else's measure, but it was hers, and it was full. Then the fever came. Thomas first. It moved fast the way those things do when they want to take something from you before you've had time to prepare. He was gone inside a week. Eleanor had sat beside his bed for 6 days straight, sleeping in a chair, waking every few hours to check his breathing. And on the 7th morning, she reached over and his chest wasn't moving. Her mother held on longer. Longer was cruelty in its own right. 3 months of slow diminishment. Her appetite going, then her strength, then finally the threat of recognition in her eyes. Eleanor had taken a leave from the school. She'd spent what savings she had. She'd written letters to a distant cousin in Pennsylvania who never wrote back. When her mother passed in the early hours of a Tuesday in February, Eleanor didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. She made the arrangements, settled what little remained of the estate, gave away the furniture, and stood in the empty kitchen one last time. Then she packed a bag and walked to the train station and bought the farthest ticket she could afford. Dunmore, Colorado. She'd never heard of it. That was the point. Quote, the town materialized through the train window at dusk on a Thursday in early November, and Eleanor's first impression was that it was uglier than she'd imagined. Not in a complete way. There was something raw and alive about it, the way the buildings pressed together along the main street like they were bracing against the mountain wind, the smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the orange flicker of lanterns in shop windows. But it was rough. The streets were unpaved and frozen hard. 2 men on horseback passed each other in front of the general store without exchanging a word. A dog lay across the entrance to what appeared to be a saloon, and no one seemed to find this worth commenting on. Eleanor stepped off the train, pulled her coat tighter, and looked up. The mountains were extraordinary. She hadn't expected that. She'd been so focused on the town, on the logistics of surviving the next few days, that she hadn't considered what it would feel like to stand at the base of something that large. The peaks cut into the pale evening sky like broken teeth, still holding their summer faces, gray rock and dark pine. But the upper ridges were already white. Snow. Real snow. More of it than she'd ever seen. Permanent and absolute. She stood there longer than she should have. You planning to sleep on the platform? She turned. A woman in her 50s stood a few feet away, arms crossed, an expression that was not quite unfriendly but wasn't warm either. She was short and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy wool coat with a tear in the left sleeve that had been mended with thread that didn't quite match. I'm looking for the Halverson boarding house, Eleanor said. I have a letter. That's mine. The woman uncrossed her arms and held out her hand. Maren Halverson. You're the teacher? Former teacher. I was hoping to find work in town. Any kind. We'll talk inside. It's getting dark and the wind off the north face comes up fast after sundown. Maren turned and started walking without waiting for Eleanor to follow. You have luggage beyond that bag? No. Maren glanced back just briefly and something passed across her face. Not pity exactly, but recognition. Like she understood what it meant to arrive somewhere with only one bag. Right, she said. Come on then. Check. The boarding house was on the east side of Dunmore, separated from the main street by 3 blocks of mixed residential and small commerce. A seamstress, a feed store, a small doctor's office with a hand-painted sign. It was a wide, two-story building with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides and a garden that had been put to bed for winter, everything cut back and covered with burlap. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and boiled potatoes, and Eleanor felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't, particularly. The wallpaper in the entrance hall was starting to peel at the corners, and the staircase banister had been repaired with mismatched wood at some point. But it was warm. It was occupied. There were voices somewhere in the back of the house, the sound of someone moving around upstairs, the distant clatter of a kitchen. Life. Ordinary, unglamorous life. Marin showed her to a room on the second floor. Small, with a single bed, a dresser with a warped drawer, and a window that looked out over the back garden. There was a quilt on the bed that had been washed so many times the colors had gone soft and uncertain, and Eleanor sat on the edge of the mattress and ran her hand across it and didn't say anything. "Meals are at 7, noon, and 6, Marin said from the doorway. "I don't run a hotel. Boarders help with chores. I'll figure out what suits you once you've rested." She paused. "There's a school here. Teacher left in September. Her husband got work in Denver. You want me to mention your name to the town council?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Please." Marin nodded once and left, and Eleanor sat in the quiet for a long time. The window was cold at the edges where the seal had worn, and outside she could see the mountains turning dark against a sky going purple and then black. The first stars appeared, more of them than she'd ever seen in Cincinnati, where the city light swallowed everything above a certain brightness. Out here, there was nothing between her and all of it. She lay back on the quilted bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she did, she didn't dream. November settled over Dunmore the way a difficult relative settles into a house. Quietly, comprehensively, and with every sign of staying. Eleanor had been in town for 3 weeks by the time the first real cold arrived. In that time, she had learned several things. That Marin Halverson's cooking was simple and filling, and she didn't discuss it. That the town council met every other Tuesday and was comprised entirely of men who had opinions about things they didn't fully understand. And that the teaching position was hers, provisionally, pending approval from a board that seemed mainly to exist so that 4 men could sit in a room together and feel important. She'd also learned that Dunmore had its gossip circuits, like every small town does, and that the circuits moved fast. Within a week of her arrival, she was aware that people knew her name, knew she'd come from Ohio, and knew she was a widow, which she wasn't, but she didn't bother correcting it, because the alternative was explaining that she'd never married, and in Dunmore in 1887, an unmarried woman of 27 who arrived alone with 1 bag was more suspicious than a widow. She'd learned the names of the main players quickly. There was Franklin Bauer, who owned the general store and served as the unofficial social arbiter of Dunmore, a thin man with careful eyes who always looked slightly amused by his own observations. There was Dr. Emmett Page, who was competent and quiet and never seemed to talk unless he had something specific to say. There was Ruth Calder, who ran the seamstress shop and who had welcomed Eleanor with the particular warmth of a woman who had been the only educated female in town for too long. And there were the stories. It was Ruth who first mentioned the name, about 10 days into Eleanor's residence, over tea and the business of letting out the hem on Eleanor's winter coat. "You'll hear about Sterling Ashford eventually," Ruth said, not looking up from her work. "Might as well hear it from me." "Who is he?" "Rich man. Cattle mostly, but timber too. Owns most of the mountain north of the valley. Thousands of acres. There's a lodge up there that they say has more rooms than the hotel." Ruth paused, bit off a thread. "He keeps to himself, doesn't come to town much. When he does, people notice." "Why?" "Because powerful men make people nervous," Ruth said simply, "and because there are stories." "What kind of stories?" Ruth set down the coat and looked at Eleanor with the frank expression of a woman deciding how much to share. "About 10 years back, there was a man who worked for him, a ranch foreman. Died under circumstances that weren't entirely clear. The official story was an accident. Some people have never quite believed the official story." Eleanor waited. "Nothing was ever proven," Ruth added quickly. "And if you ask me, Hector Smalls was a mean drunk who'd made enemies all over the territory. And Sterling Ashford barely knew the man's first name. But when you're the richest man in the county and something bad happens on your land, the story finds a way to stick to you." She picked up the coat again. He's not a man you need to worry about. He lives up that mountain like he's comfortable being alone, and mostly he is. And yet people talk about him. People talk about everyone. Ruth looked up again, and there was something knowing in her eyes. Including you, dear. You arrived a month ago with one bag and no husband and a letter from a minister, and half this town already has an opinion about who you are and why you're here. Eleanor absorbed this. What's the other half's opinion? That you're a school teacher trying to start over somewhere new, and it's none of anyone's business why. Ruth smiled briefly. It was more honest than warm, which Eleanor had come to appreciate about her. I'm in the second half. Thank you, Eleanor said, and meant it. The school was a single-room building at the far end of the main street, with 8 rows of desks in varying states of disrepair, and a blackboard that had been wiped so many times it was more gray than black. There were 23 students on Eleanor's first day, ages ranging from 6 to 14, of widely varying levels of attention and academic preparation. She had not stood in front of a class in nearly 2 years. She'd been afraid, on the walk over that first morning, that she would open her mouth and nothing would come out, that the grief and the exhaustion would have taken that from her too. It hadn't. Something settled into her the moment she walked through the door, and 34 eyes turned toward her. Some muscle memory, some part of her that hadn't been reached by everything that had happened. She set her bag on the teacher's desk, looked out at the rows of faces, suspicious and curious and bored in roughly equal measure, and said, My name is Miss Hart. I'm going to find out what you know, and then we're going to work from there. That's the only method I have. If you have questions, ask them. If you don't understand something, say so. I don't have a great deal of patience for pretending. A boy in the third row, maybe 10 years old, red-haired, with the expression of someone who had already decided this would be a waste of his time, raised his hand. Yes, Eleanor said. Are you from the East? Yes. My dad says Easterners don't know anything about how things actually work. Several children turned to see her reaction. Your dad might be right, Eleanor said. What's your name? Caleb. Well, Caleb, I don't know how to rope a steer or read a winter sky, and I've never worked a cattle drive. I'll freely admit all of that. But I can teach you to read well enough that you can learn anything else you decide you need to know. Does that seem like a fair trade? Caleb thought about this longer than she expected. Then he uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. Yeah, he said. Okay. It happened on a Wednesday in early December. Eleanor had dismissed the class an hour earlier than usual. A cold front had been moving in since the morning, and by noon the sky had gone the color of an old bruise, low and flat and heavy. Several of the children had long walks home, and she wasn't willing to hold them until the standard hour with weather like that coming. She had intended to walk directly back to the boarding house. She wasn't entirely sure afterward what had made her go the other way. There was a lookout, a ridge about a mile east of town that Ruth had mentioned once, a place where on clear days you could see 3 mountain faces and the valley spreading out between them. Eleanor had been meaning to visit it since she arrived, and she'd kept putting it off, and standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse watching the sky go dark and wrong above the peaks, she had thought, if I don't go now, winter will close it off, and I'll spend 4 months wondering what I missed. That was the decision, that small, ordinary piece of poor judgment. She walked east along the frozen ground, with her coat buttoned to the throat and her wool scarf wrapped twice. And for the first 20 minutes, the cold was manageable. Unpleasant, yes, but bearable in the way that December cold in Colorado was always bearable if you moved. The ridge was further than she remembered Ruth describing, but she could see it ahead, the land rising toward a line of pine trees and then a break in the tree line where the view would open up. She reached it. She stood at the edge and looked out. It was extraordinary. Even with the sky like that, even with the storm coming, the mountains were extraordinary. 3 massive faces of rock and pine and winter white, arranged like a painting that no one would believe was real, the valley between them deep and shadow-filled, the last of the light catching the upper snowfields and turning them briefly gold. She stood there for 11 minutes. She counted later, because it would matter. When she turned to go back, the wind hit her. It had not been wind before, a cold, persistent movement of air. This was different. This came off the northern face like something intentional, like the mountain had been waiting for her to turn her back. It stole her breath. It found the gaps in her coat she hadn't known existed, and behind it, almost instantly, came the snow. Not delicate snow. Not the kind of snow that accumulates slowly and beautifully. This was horizontal, driven, almost blinding. Small, hard pellets of ice mixed with it, and the temperature dropped so fast that she gasped before she could stop herself. She started moving. The problem was direction. She'd oriented herself entirely by visual landmarks on the walk out. The shape of the ridge against the sky, the angle of the light through the trees, the silhouette of Dunmore's church steeple in the distance. Within 3 minutes of the storm hitting, she had none of those things. The visibility dropped to 20 feet, then 10, then less than that. The trees she remembered were behind her somewhere. The path she'd followed was under 4 inches of new snow and indistinguishable from the rest of the terrain. She kept moving because stopping felt like surrender. She moved for what felt like a very long time, and she was not moving in the right direction. The cold was not like anything she'd experienced before. It started at the edges, fingertips, ears, the end of her nose, a sharp and specific pain that was, at first, almost interesting in its intensity. Then it became something else. It began to dull. The sharpness gave way to a heaviness, and the heaviness spread inward, and Eleanor recognized distantly that this was the thing they warned about. The cold that stopped hurting was the cold that was going to kill you. She'd been walking for over an hour by her best estimate. She'd fallen twice, once into a shallow drift that had cost her a glove, once hard onto frozen ground when her foot went through a crust of ice over nothing. Her knee was bad. She was limping. The snow had found its way inside her collar and her sleeves and was melting against her skin in a way that was no longer cold but had begun to feel strangely like heat. She knew what that meant too. She stopped walking, not because she'd decided to, but because her body made the decision before her mind did. She stood in the lee of a rock outcropping that blocked some of the wind and tried to think clearly, which was becoming difficult. "You are lost," she told herself. "You are cold. Those are facts. Now think." She'd been heading, she'd thought, southeast, back toward Dunmore. But the terrain had gone wrong somewhere. She could hear it in the way the wind moved around her, the way the sound was swallowed too quickly on all sides, suggesting she was lower and more enclosed than she should have been. There was a canyon somewhere to the east of the lookout ridge. Ruth had mentioned it. Significant drop. Not the kind of thing you walked into accidentally unless you walked into it at night in a blizzard. She pressed her back against the rock and looked at her remaining gloved hand and the bare hand, red and stiff, that had lost its covering in the fall. She tucked it under her arm. It didn't help much. She thought about Thomas. She thought about sitting beside his bed for 6 days, watching his chest. And she thought about how tired she'd been then and how different this kind of tired was. That had been grief tired. This was body tired, the kind that came from inside the cells themselves. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, I don't want to die here. Not poetically, not with any particular beauty. She just didn't want to. She was tired and cold and had made a stupid decision about an afternoon walk. And she didn't want that to be the end of it, the whole sum of everything she'd survived to get to this point. She pushed off the rock and started walking again. She heard the horse before she saw it. Sound traveled strangely in a blizzard, muffled in some directions, carried from surprising distances in others. She'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes since the rock, slower now, her knee protesting badly, when she heard something that didn't belong to the storm, a heavy, rhythmic percussion in the snow. A horse moving fast. She stopped. The visibility was worse than before. The light almost completely gone now behind the cloud cover and the snow. The sound moved to her right, and she turned toward it and opened her mouth to shout, and the cold took the sound before it left her throat. She tried again, louder. "Hey! Hello!" The hoofbeats slowed. Eleanor took 3 steps toward the sound and immediately regretted it. The ground dropped away slightly, and her bad knee buckled, and she caught herself with both hands in the snow. The bare hand screamed at her. She got up. "Hello!" This time it came out properly. There was a long moment. The wind shifted direction. Then through the white came a shape, enormous, dark, moving, and Eleanor had a split second of something that wasn't quite rational fear before she understood that it was a horse, and on the horse was a man, and the man had seen her. He pulled up. Not gently. The horse was agitated, blowing hard, shifting in the snow. But he controlled it, one firm command that she couldn't hear over the wind, and the animal settled enough. He looked down at her. She couldn't see much of his face. He was wearing a heavy coat with the collar turned up and a wide-brimmed hat that was doing its best against the weather. He was large, tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders. But what she registered most was not his size. It was the fact that he was looking at her with the particular focused attention of someone who was rapidly assessing a problem and deciding what to do about it. "You're not dressed for this," he said. His voice was low and carried well, the kind of voice accustomed to making itself heard in outdoor conditions. "I know," Eleanor said, and was embarrassed to hear her own voice shaking with cold. "How long have you been out here?" "I'm not—" She stopped, swallowed. "I don't know exactly. An hour and a half, maybe more." Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't fully see it. He swung down from the horse in a single movement. He was definitely tall, taller than the proportions of the saddle had suggested, and stepped toward her. He was close enough now that she could see his face, or the part of it not obscured by the coat collar. Dark eyes under the brim of the hat, a jaw set in the way of someone who didn't waste expressions. He wasn't young, mid-30s, maybe, with lines around his eyes that came from weather and squinting, not from laughing. He looked at her bare hand. Without saying anything, he pulled off his own right glove and held it out. She stared at it. "Put it on," he said. Not harsh, not gentle, just direct. She put it on. The glove was warm from his hand and too large for her, and she gripped it closed with her fingers and felt something in her chest go loose with relief. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes." "You're neat." "I can ride." He studied her for a moment. She had the feeling he was deciding whether to believe her, and she held his gaze because she needed him to believe her even if her knee was currently making the claim more complicated than she was letting on. "Up then," he said. "I'll lead the horse down. The terrain between here and the valley trail is bad." "Where are we going?" He'd already turned back to the horse. He paused and looked at her over his shoulder, and in the gray-white of the storm, his expression was unreadable. "Somewhere warm," he said. "That's the priority." She didn't argue. Getting onto the horse was not graceful. Her knee gave out on the first attempt, and she grabbed for the saddle horn and missed, and he was there immediately. Not in the way of someone who had been watching for her to fail, but in the way of someone who had simply anticipated the problem and positioned himself to solve it. His hands at her waist were firm and entirely impersonal. He got her up. She settled into the saddle and gripped with her thighs and tried to make her body do what it was supposed to do. He took the reins and led the horse forward. She couldn't tell where they were going. She had completely lost her orientation now, and she was reduced to sitting on the horse and trusting a stranger with no real alternative. She watched the back of his head, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved through the deep snow without apparent difficulty. The stride of a man who knew exactly where he was, who had walked this terrain enough times that the blizzard was an inconvenience rather than a crisis. At some point, she realized she'd stopped shivering. She didn't know if that was the warmth from the horse or the beginning of something worse. She tightened her grip on the saddle horn and said nothing. "Stay awake," he said without looking back. "I'm awake." "Say something then. Anything." She thought. "I'm a schoolteacher," she said. "I moved here from Cincinnati 2 months ago. My name is Eleanor Hart." A pause. "Sterling Ashford," he said. She knew the name. Ruth's voice in her memory, even and deliberate. Rich man, cattle mostly, but timber too. "Owns most of the mountain north of the valley." She said nothing. "Keep talking," he said. "I went to the lookout ridge," she said. "I thought I could make it there and back before the storm came. It was a foolish decision." "Yes," he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "I don't usually make foolish decisions. Most people who get lost in mountain storms don't usually," he said. "They just make one." They walked. The wind was still bad, but she realized after a while that he had shifted their direction, angling across the wind rather than into it, which reduced the worst of the bite. He knew what he was doing. He moved with the particular confidence of someone who had learned a thing through sustained practice rather than natural talent. Careful, methodical, nothing wasted. "How far?" she asked. Far enough. Stop thinking about it. I can't stop thinking about it. Then think about something else. Such as? He glanced back at her then, and she saw, for a moment, quickly, something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. How deep is the snow going to get, he said, and how much worse is this wind? It wasn't funny. It was also, somehow, a little funny. She held onto the saddle horn and did not quite laugh, but something in her chest shifted and she thought, I am going to survive this. The lights appeared out of the storm like something she'd invented. She saw them first as faint orange smears in the white. 3, then 5, then more, arranged in a configuration that suggested a structure larger than she'd expected. She blinked, thinking she might be imagining them, and they didn't disappear. They got larger. And then the wind shifted one final time and the snow thinned briefly, and she saw it. It was not what she'd have called a lodge, particularly. Lodge suggested something rustic, something that made a virtue of roughness. This was a building, large, 2 stories in the main section, with a wing extending to the left, built of dark timber and stone in a way that looked like it had grown out of the mountain rather than been constructed on it. There were lights in several windows. There was smoke rising from 2 chimneys. A man came out of a stable to the right of the main structure, young, maybe 20, moving fast with his head down against the wind. Mr. Ashford, he had to shout it. I've been out twice looking. I know. Take care of him. Sterling handed over the reins without ceremony and turned back to Eleanor. Can you get down, or... I can get down, she said, and she could, mostly. Her knee made the landing unpleasant, and she stumbled, and his hand was at her elbow before she'd finished deciding whether she needed it. Come on, he said. The inside of the lodge hit her like walking into another world. Warmth first. Real warmth. The kind that pressed against her face and made her realize how cold her skin had become. Then light. Not harsh, but substantial, from 2 large stone fireplaces on opposite ends of a long main room. Then the room itself, which was larger than any single room she'd ever stood in. High ceiling with exposed timber beams, walls of rough stone between sections of dark wood paneling, furniture that was neither delicate nor careless, just large and solid and present. There were bookshelves against the far wall, floor to ceiling, filled haphazardly enough to suggest they were actually used. A desk near one window with papers spread across it. A coat rack by the door with more coats than one person needed. A woman appeared from a doorway toward the back. 50s, iron gray hair, a practical expression. Mrs. Dolan, Sterling said, Miss Hart needs dry clothes, something hot, and the room at the end of the 2nd floor. Her knee needs to be looked at, and her hand as well. He paused. Frostbite on the hand. Catch it early. Mrs. Dolan took one look at Eleanor, then nodded briskly and held out her hand. Come on then, let's get you sorted. Eleanor followed her toward the stairs, then stopped and turned back. Sterling Ashford was standing by the nearer fireplace, his coat still on, his hat in his hand, looking not at her but at the fire. His face in the firelight was still largely unreadable, but there was something in the set of him, a tension he hadn't quite released, or perhaps one he was only now recognizing, that made him look, just briefly, like a man who had not expected the evening to go quite this way either. Thank you, Eleanor said. He turned, met her eyes, held them for a moment. Get warm, he said. Then he looked back at the fire. She went with Mrs. Dolan. The room at the end of the 2nd floor was warmer than any space she'd occupied in months. There was a fireplace, lit already, which meant someone had come up ahead of her, and a bed with more blankets than she'd seen stacked in one place, and a basin of water that was warm to the touch and miraculous. Mrs. Dolan worked quickly, and without excessive commentary, dry clothes produced from somewhere, Eleanor's bare hand examined with the practiced eye of a woman who dealt with cold weather injuries before, the verdict good, red and painful but not deeply damaged, caught in time. Her knee probed with firm and reasonably gentle fingers, and declared bruised but intact. You're lucky, Mrs. Dolan said, wrapping Eleanor's hand in clean cloth. I know. He doesn't usually ride out in weather like this. She said it flatly, as a fact, not as a reproach. He was checking the north fence line. 3 sections got buried in the last storm.
If he'd finished the check and come back west instead of cutting across the ridge. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I know, Eleanor said again.
Eat something. Mrs. Dolan set a tray on the small table by the window. Bread, something hot in a bowl that smelled like beef and root vegetables, a cup of something that turned out to be strong tea. Sleep if you need to. Storm's going to be bad through tonight. We'll see what the morning looks like. She left, and Eleanor sat at the small table and ate without tasting much of it, and looked out the window at the storm pressing itself against the glass, and thought about luck and timing and the small hinge points of circumstances that separated one outcome from another. Outside, the wind was still howling. Inside, the fire cracked and shifted and threw light across the ceiling. She pulled the borrowed blanket around her shoulders and looked at her bandaged hand and thought about a man standing by a fireplace, looking into the flames, his hat in his hand, who had not once asked her what she'd been thinking going out in weather like that, who had just looked at her, assessed the problem, and done something about it. She'd known men in her life who would have led with the questions, who would have needed to establish their own wisdom against her mistake before they helped. It would have been 3 sentences of pointed observation before the glove came off. He'd led with the glove. She looked out at the storm for a while longer. Then she lay down on the bed, still in the borrowed clothes, and closed her eyes. In the morning, she would figure out how to get back to Dunmore. Tonight, she was just going to be warm. She woke to gray light and silence. The storm had passed sometime in the night. Not quietly, she suspected, but she'd slept through the worst of it with the particular depth of the genuinely exhausted. Her knee was stiff and sore. Her bandaged hand ached in a diffuse, manageable way. She sat on the edge of the bed and took stock of herself. She was alive. She was warm. She was in a room that wasn't hers, in a house that wasn't hers, and somewhere downstairs was a man she'd met in a blizzard, and whose reputation she'd been told about over tea and a hem repair. She found her clothes, dried and returned at some point she'd slept through, folded on the chair by the door. The house was quiet when she made her way downstairs. The main room looked different in daylight, still large, still solid, but less dramatic without the firelight. The bookshelves were fuller than she'd registered the night before, and not organized in any way she could immediately parse. Philosophy next to engineering manuals, next to what appeared to be agricultural survey reports, next to a worn volume of Shakespeare. There were maps on one wall, large and detailed, marked with notations in ink. The desk by the window had more papers than she'd noticed, weighted down with a smooth river stone on one corner. Sterling Ashford was sitting at the table near the far fireplace with a cup of coffee and a newspaper that was probably 2 weeks old. He looked up when she came down the stairs. In daylight, he looked different than she'd seen him in the storm. Less the figure from a crisis and more a person. He was wearing a heavy wool shirt and work trousers. The elegance she'd imagined from the description of his wealth was not apparent in the way he dressed. His face was all angles, not unpleasant ones, with the kind of weathering that came from years of outdoor work. The dark eyes were sharper than she remembered, but not unkind. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She stopped at the foot of the stairs. "I owe you an apology for the trouble." "You owe me nothing." He said it easily, the way someone says a thing they mean plainly. "Sit down if you want coffee." She sat down. Mrs. Dolan appeared, poured coffee, and disappeared again with the particular efficiency of a woman who did not believe in hovering. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Outside, the window showed a world transformed. The storm had left 1.5 feet of snow across every visible surface, and the morning light was coming off it with a brightness that was almost difficult to look at. "I need to get back to town," Eleanor said. "I have class tomorrow morning." "The South Road will be passable by this afternoon," he said. "I'll have someone take you." "You don't have to." "Miss Hart." He said it without weight, just simply. "The South Road is 4 miles of drifted snow and narrow switchbacks. You'll have a buggy and someone who knows the road. That's not a favor. That's logistics." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and neither of them looked away immediately, which was interesting. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and went back to his newspaper. She drank her coffee. After a moment, she said, "The bookshelves." He looked up. "Philosophy next to surveying manuals," she said. "I was trying to understand the organization." Something shifted in his face, not quite amusement, but something in that direction. There isn't one, he said. How do you find anything? I remember where I put it. He set the newspaper down. I take it this bothers you. I spent 2 years organizing the school library in Cincinnati. Yes, it bothers me a little. The school had one? He said it with what she was fairly certain was dry humor. It had a closet with crates in it. That's what I started with. She looked at the shelves again. You have lock next to, I don't even know what that is. Agricultural surveys? Water rights reports, he said. Colorado Territorial Government, 1883. Why do you have those? He studied her for a moment. Because I own water rights on 3 tributaries, and if you want to keep them, you learn the reports. And lock? Because there's only so much water rights law a person can read in one sitting. She didn't quite smile, but it was close. What do you actually read? She asked. When you're choosing. He seemed to consider the question with more genuine thought than she expected. History, he said finally. Military history, mostly. Some political philosophy. I find I'm less interested in ideas about how things should work than in documentation of how they actually did. That's practical. It's honest, he said. There's a difference. She drank her coffee and looked out the window at the snow. You've been in Dunmore 2 months, he said. It wasn't a question exactly. You know that? Small territory, he said. News travels. A pause. How are you finding it? Cold, she said. Then, interesting. The children are good students, mostly. The town has a personality. What kind? She thought about how to answer that honestly without being rude about it. Tight, she said. It watches itself. I'm still being evaluated. You will be for another 6 months, he said, without apparent judgment. Then you'll either be part of it or you won't. Which do you prefer? He looked at her. Which do I prefer? Are you part of it or aren't you? The question sat there. She wasn't sure why she'd asked it. It was more direct than she'd intended. But he didn't seem offended. He seemed, if anything, to take it seriously. I'm not sure that's the right frame, he said after a moment. I own land here. I have business here. What I'm part of is the county, the territory, the economics of it. Whether I'm part of the town in the way you mean. He paused. No, not particularly. By choice? He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it briefly. Some of both, he said. She didn't press it. He didn't seem to invite it, and she wasn't sure she had the standing to. And besides, Mrs. Dolan arrived at that moment with bread and eggs and the businesslike energy of someone who did not believe in uninterrupted conversations going on too long between people who hadn't known each other yesterday. They ate largely in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Outside, the snow caught the morning light and gave it back doubled, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible through the thick walls, the world was very, very quiet. It was the quietest Eleanor had been in a long time. She didn't quite know what to do with that. She left the lodge at 2 in the afternoon in a buggy driven by a ranch hand named Cord, who was 18 years old and talked about his horse for all 4 miles back to Dunmore with the focused passion of someone who had not yet found it necessary to be interesting about anything else. Eleanor sat beside him and let the words wash past her and watched the mountains. They were different after the storm, more present, somehow, as if the violence of the previous night had stripped something away and left the real thing. Dunmore appeared around the last bend, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the main street already showing the marks of feet and hooves in the new snow. Cord led her off in front of the boarding house with a tip of his hat and drove away. Maren Halverson was in the front room when Eleanor came through the door. She looked up, took in Eleanor's borrowed coat and the bandaged hand, and said nothing for a moment. Well, she said finally. I got lost in the storm, Eleanor said. I stayed the night at a ranch north of the valley. Whose ranch? Eleanor set her bag down. Ashford's. Maren looked at her with an expression that was complicated enough that Eleanor couldn't fully read it. Then she stood up and said, Dinner's in an hour. You should rest that knee. She left the room. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of the boarding house and listened to the ordinary sounds of the house around her. Something simmering in the kitchen, someone moving upstairs, the wind coming off the mountain and pressing briefly at the windows. and thought about a large room full of misorganized books, and coffee drunk in morning silence, and a glove pulled off and handed over without comment in the middle of a blizzard. Outside, the mountains were very still under their new white weight. She went upstairs. The talk started the day she got back. Eleanor had expected it. She had not expected how fast it moved, or how specific it would become within 48 hours of her return. By Friday morning, 2 days after Cord had dropped her off in front of the boarding house, she walked into the general store for lamp oil and a pound of flour, and Franklin Bauer looked up from his ledger with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for her to come through the door. "Miss Hart," he said, "heard you had quite an adventure Wednesday." "I got caught in the storm," she said. "It happens." "Stayed the night up at Ashford's place, I understand." She set her items on the counter. "I did. The South Road was snowed in. I left the following afternoon." She met his eyes pleasantly and waited. Franklin picked up the flour and weighed it with the unhurried movements of a man conducting 2 activities simultaneously. "Sterling Ashford doesn't usually take in strays," he said. The word strays was delivered lightly, as if it were casual, which meant it wasn't. "I imagine most people don't get lost on his mountain in a December blizzard," Eleanor said. "So the sample is probably limited." She smiled at him. "How much do I owe you?" He told her. She paid. He counted out her change with the deliberateness of someone who wasn't finished. "He's a private man," Franklin said. "People around here take notice when something changes about his habits." "I didn't change his habits," Eleanor said, picking up her items. "I was cold. He had a fireplace. It was a practical arrangement." She left. Outside, the cold bit at her face, and she walked the 3 blocks back to the boarding house with the errand-focused stride of someone who was not going to give the main street of Dunmore anything worth watching. But her jaw was tight, and she knew it, and she was irritated at herself for being irritated, because she'd known this was coming and had thought she'd prepared herself for it. Knowing something is coming and experiencing it arriving turned out to be different. Ruth Calder was more direct about it, which Eleanor appreciated more than she would have expected. "People are going to make assumptions," Ruth said that Saturday, over the business of Eleanor's winter coat which had sustained damage in the fall. "That's simply what people do when 2 unmarried individuals spend a night under the same roof, regardless of the circumstances." "The circumstances involved a blizzard and frostbite," Eleanor said. "I know. Most sensible people know. Sensible people, unfortunately, are not what drives the conversation." Ruth examined the torn lining with her reading glasses low on her nose. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking as someone who is on your side." "Ask." "What was he like?" Eleanor considered the question. "Practical," she said. "Quiet. Reads too much. In no particular order. Doesn't waste words." She paused. "He gave me his glove. In the storm. Without being asked." Ruth looked up over her glasses. "And he didn't make me feel stupid for getting lost," Eleanor added. "He just dealt with the situation." Ruth held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then looked back down at the coat. "Well," she said, in a tone that covered several opinions she'd elected not to state directly. "That's something." "It's not anything," Eleanor said. "I stayed one night and came back to town. That's all it was." "Of course," Ruth said, and said nothing else. Eleanor looked out the window at the frozen street and did not think about a room full of misorganized books and a man who drank his coffee in silence and looked at the fire in a way that made him seem, for just a moment, like someone who spent a great deal of time alone and had mostly made his peace with that. She didn't think about it at all. That's it. December moved on with the particular grinding momentum of a mountain winter. The school kept her busy. She'd started a reading group for the older students 3 afternoons a week, and Caleb, the red-haired skeptic from the first day, had turned into the most persistent attendee, arriving early and staying late and arguing about everything he read with an energy that suggested he'd been waiting his whole short life for someone to argue with properly. "It says here the Roman army could march 20 miles a day," he said one Thursday afternoon, jabbing his finger at the history volume she'd brought in. "That's not possible." "Why not?" "Because I can barely walk 5 miles in a day carrying my school bag." "You're 11, Eleanor said, "and you're not a Roman soldier." "Still, try it and report back." She turned a page. "Document your preparation, your rest intervals, and what you ate. If you walk 20 miles and it kills you, I'll concede the point." Caleb stared at her. Then he pulled out a piece of paper. I'm going to do this, he said. I know you are, she said, and moved to the next student. The afternoons were good. The mornings were good. The evenings in the boarding house were manageable, though occasionally lonely in the way that shared spaces could be lonely. You were surrounded by evidence of other people's lives without quite being part of them. She had not expected in the middle of the third week of December to receive a letter. It was waiting on the hall table when she came home from school. A plain envelope with her name on it in handwriting that was spare and deliberate, each letter given exactly the room it needed and no more. She took it upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and opened it. Miss Hart, I have a complete set of county water survey reports from 1879 that belong in the Territorial Archive in Denver. I've been meaning to send them for 2 years. The archive is requesting them again. If you have any interest in reviewing them before I do, I understand you have a view on document organization. They're available. No obligation. The South Road is clear through the rest of the week. S. Ashford. She read it twice. Then she folded it back along its crease and set it on the dresser and looked at it from across the room, as if distance would help her decide what it was. It was not a social invitation. It was not quite a practical offer either. It was something in between, something that was constructed to look like a practical offer, but had been sent by a man who had territorial water survey reports he could have sent to Denver 6 weeks ago without mentioning them to anyone. She knew enough about Sterling Ashford, from what little she'd seen and what the town had told her, to understand that he didn't do things impulsively. She looked at the letter on the dresser. She was going to write back and say no. She composed the polite declination in her head while she changed out of her school clothes and washed her hands and went down to dinner. She had the phrasing worked out by the time Marin set down the soup. She wrote back the following morning. The letter said, "The South Road, you said, is clear through Thursday. I can come Wednesday afternoon if that suits." She dropped it at the post office on her way to school. She spent the walk composing a reasonable explanation for herself that did not involve the fact that he had given her his glove without being asked. Brsham. Cord met her at the South Trailhead on Wednesday, with a horse already saddled, her own to ride this time, a steady gray named Fletcher who had no opinions about anything and was perfect for a November mountain road. The ride up took 40 minutes through terrain that was beautiful in the particular bleak way of a mountain winter, the pines carrying their snow loads in patient silence, the creek to the east running dark and fast between ice-edged banks, the sky a hard and cloudless blue. The lodge looked different in daylight without a storm. Larger, actually. She could see more of the extent of the place, the outbuildings and the stable, and what appeared to be a workshop behind the main structure. The stone and timber of the main building had a gravity to it, the look of something built to last longer than the people who'd built it. Sterling met her at the door. He was wearing the same kind of work clothes she'd seen him in the morning after the storm, and he looked no different than he had then. No ceremony to his greeting, no performance. "You came," he said. "I said I would. People say a lot of things." He stepped back to let her in. "The reports are on the desk." The main room was as she remembered it, warmer today, or maybe she was already warm from the ride. The bookshelves stood their ground against the far wall. The desk was slightly more organized than it had been, which she suspected was deliberate. The water survey reports were stacked in 3 piles on the table near the fireplace, dozens of volumes, varying sizes, some in better condition than others. "These all need to go to Denver?" she asked. "Eventually," he said. "The archive wants the 1879 set first. The others are mine to keep." She sat down and pulled the nearest volume toward her. He sat across from her and appeared to go back to something he'd been working on, not performing disinterest, just actually occupied. The fire cracked. Outside, the afternoon light was already shortening. She worked through the first volume with the kind of focus she'd always found easier in physical spaces than mental ones. If her hands were busy, her mind organized itself around the task. The reports were dense, technical, occasionally interesting in the way that very specific documentation of contested resources was interesting. Who owned what? Who disputed it? Who had the political leverage to resolve it in their favor? "You annotated these," she said after a while, looking at the margins of the 3rd volume. "Yes." "In 3 different inks." "I read them 3 times, over different years." She looked up. He was watching her with the steady, evaluating attention she'd first seen in the blizzard. Not uncomfortable, just thorough. Why? She asked. Because water rights in this territory are going to matter more than anyone currently thinks they do, he said. The population is growing. The cattle operations are growing. In 10 years, there will be fights over every creek and tributary that currently run unclaimed. He paused. I'd rather understand the legal history before those fights happen. And the philosophy books? She asked. Those are preparation for the fights too? Something flickered across his face. No, he said. Those are for after, when I need to remember there's more going on than who owns a water right. She looked back down at the report. That's a more honest answer than I expected. I don't see much point in the other kind. She believed him. That was the thing. She found herself believing him in the way you believed someone who had established, through a series of small actions rather than large statements, that they meant what they said. He hadn't performed honesty. He'd just been honest, consistently, in contexts where it would have been easy to deflect. She worked for another hour. He worked. Mrs. Dolan brought tea at some point and set it down and left without commentary. The afternoon went blue and then gold in the windows. The Hector Smalls story, Eleanor said, and then stopped because she hadn't actually decided to say it. Sterling set down his pen. She looked at him directly. I've been told there are people who believe it was more than an accident. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. His face had gone very still, the way it went when he was deciding something. Hector Smalls fell from a ridge on the northeast property line at 3 a.m. in a late spring snowstorm. He said finally. He was drunk. There were 2 ranch hands within a quarter-mile of him who heard him fall and called for help within minutes. I was in Denver at a land title hearing and didn't arrive back until the following day. All of this is documented and was reviewed by the county sheriff at the time. He picked up his pen again. What the story says is that my wealth was enough to make the documentation irrelevant. Is that what it says? Or is it just that the documentation was never enough to make people comfortable? He looked at her. I'm not accusing you of anything, she said. I'm asking what you think the story is actually about. A long pause. He turned the pen in his fingers once, the way someone does when they're thinking through something they don't usually say out loud. I think, he said carefully, that when a man has a great deal and others have less, there's a kind of satisfaction in believing the great deal was gotten wrongly. It doesn't require evidence, it just requires distance and the right story. And you've never tried to correct it? How would you correct it? He said. Argue your own innocence in public? That makes it look like guilt. Ignore it? That looks like arrogance. There's no move that works when people have already decided. He set the pen down again, this time with finality. So I stopped trying. Eleanor thought about that. She thought about walking into Franklin Bauer's store 2 weeks ago, and the word strays delivered casually across a scale. That's a lonely way to live, she said. It came out more directly than she'd intended. He looked at her for a moment, and his face did something complicated. Not quite discomfort, but the expression of someone who has had a true thing said to them that they weren't prepared to hear. Yes, he said simply. It is. She looked back at the survey report. He looked back at his papers. The fire settled with a soft collapse of wood, sending up a brief shower of light. Neither of them said anything else about it, but something in the room had shifted by a fraction. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. Just the small realignment of 2 people who had told each other something true and were now sitting with the weight of that. She stayed until the light was almost gone. He walked her out to where Cord was waiting with the horses, and he said, with the precise brevity of a man who chose his words for weight rather than warmth, the rest of the 1879 reports need to be cross-referenced before they go to Denver. It's going to take more than one afternoon. She took the reins from Cord, settled in the saddle, looked down at him in the last of the gray winter light. I'm available Saturdays, she said. Afternoon. He nodded once. She rode back down the mountain with Cord and the sound of Fletcher's hooves in the snow and the dark pines closing over the trail above her. And she thought about a man who had stopped trying to correct a story that had followed him for 10 years and was now offering her water survey reports as a reason to come back. She thought about the loneliness of it. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announced itself and demanded sympathy, but the quiet, entrenched kind. The kind that had been there so long it had started to feel like ordinary life. She'd known that kind. She'd been carrying it since February. Dunmore's lights appeared below,
small and scattered in the early dark, and Eleanor pressed her heels lightly into Fletcher's sides and let the horse find its own pace on the familiar road, and she didn't try to make anything out of the afternoon that it hadn't been. It had been water survey reports, an honest conversation by a fireplace. That was all. She was nearly sure of that.
January arrived and Dunmore contracted around itself in the way mountain towns did in deep winter. Not shutting down entirely, but drawing in, the social life condensing into smaller spaces, the outdoor errands quick and purposeful rather than leisurely. The school continued. The reading group continued. Caleb attempted his 20-mile walk, documented it in 4 pages of dense and occasionally inaccurate notes, and arrived at school the following day moving like an elderly man with genuine grievances against both his legs.
"Well?" Eleanor asked. "I did 18 miles, he said, dropping into his seat with a wince that he tried to conceal and didn't. "Before my boot gave out, which is near 20. It's not 20. It's within 10%, which in empirical work is generally called, it's not 20, he repeated. But there was something behind his stubbornness that was almost pleased with itself, and Eleanor let it alone. She went up to the lodge on Saturdays, not every Saturday, twice in January, 3 times in February. Each time the stated reason was the water survey reports, which were genuinely extensive and genuinely needed organization, and each time the actual content of the afternoon extended well beyond the reports. She learned in pieces the way you learn things about a person who didn't offer information voluntarily, that he had a brother somewhere in the territory he hadn't spoken to in 8 years over a land dispute that had been resolved legally but not personally, that he'd served briefly in the late military campaigns in the Southwest and come back with a particular view of the relationship between institutional authority and actual competence, that he'd bought the first 1,000 acres of his mountain property at 23 with money inherited from an uncle who'd made an unlikely fortune in Nevada silver, and had spent the following 12 years building the cattle and timber operations largely through a combination of calculated risk and the willingness to do work that other wealthy landowners delegated entirely. She learned that he had an opinion about almost everything she raised, and that his opinions were generally considered and occasionally wrong, and that when she told him he was wrong about something, he didn't capitulate immediately or defend himself past the point of reason. He adjusted. He sat with the new information and found a way to incorporate it without making it a large event. It was a rare quality in a person. She'd met a few people who had it, and they'd all been worth knowing. He learned things about her, too, though she was aware of controlling what she offered more carefully than he probably did, out of a habit of self-protection she had developed over the last 18 months. She told him about Thomas in January, sitting by the fireplace with the reports finished and the tea gone cold. Not the whole story, just the shape of it, the fever, the speed of it, the 6 days in the chair. He listened without filling the silence with useless things. When she was finished, he said, "That's a long time to hold on to someone while they're going." "Yes," she said. "Did it help?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know," she said. "I think I needed to do it. Whether it helped him, I can't say." "It was for you as much as for him," he said, not as a criticism. "Yes," she said. "Probably it was." He nodded and looked at the fire and didn't say anything else about it, which was exactly right. February's last Saturday was the one that changed the texture of things, though not in any way she could have pointed to directly afterward. She'd arrived to find him in the stable rather than the house. One of the mares had been sick through the week, and he was checking her himself rather than leaving it to the hands. Eleanor stood in the stable door and watched him for a moment before he heard her, kneeling in the straw beside the animal, his hand flat against the horse's neck, talking to her in a low, even tone that wasn't for anyone else's benefit. He looked up when he registered her presence. He was not embarrassed exactly, but there was the slight adjustment of a person caught in an unguarded moment. "She's better," he said. "Fever broke yesterday." "What was it?" "Strangles, the vet thinks. We caught it early." He stood, brushing straw from his knee. The mare turned her head and looked at Eleanor with the large, liquid calm of a horse who had decided not to have an opinion about strangers. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said. "She's difficult," he said, and there was a warmth in it that he probably didn't intend to show. "Smart horses are always difficult. They know when you're not paying attention." Eleanor looked at him. He was looking at the horse with the same expression he sometimes had when he looked at the fire, present, but somewhere else inside it. She had come to understand this as simply the way he was, not absent, not cold, just a man with a significant interior life that didn't perform itself for outside audiences. "Sterling," she said. He looked at her. She'd used his first name without thinking, and they both registered it at the same time. She didn't take it back.
"The town is going to keep talking," she said, "about this, about me coming up here. I want you to know that I'm aware of it, and I'm not going to stop coming because of it." Something happened in his face that was not quite the carefully maintained composure she was used to seeing there. "You don't have to," he started. "I'm not saying it for reassurance," she said. "I'm saying it because you should know where I stand. You've been dealing with what the town thinks about you for a long time, and I'm about to make it more complicated, and that's a decision I'm making deliberately." She held his gaze. I wanted to say it out loud. He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be meaningful. The mare shifted in her straw. Outside, the February wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like the ocean, which Eleanor had never actually heard but had always imagined this way. "All right," he said finally. His voice was a little different than usual, less even. "All right." She went inside. He came in 10 minutes later, and they spent the rest of the afternoon on the survey reports, which at this point neither of them entirely believed were the actual reason she was there, though they were both willing to maintain the useful fiction a while longer. The mountains outside the windows were very white and very still, and the fire burned the way fires did in that lodge, steadily, without drama, with the particular reliability of a thing that had been doing its job for a long time. March came in hard and left harder, the way Colorado months sometimes did, as if the season itself was reluctant to concede anything. The snow on the upper ridges didn't move. The creek at the base of the valley ran high and dark with melt from lower elevations, but above the tree line, winter was still fully in residence and making no apologies about it. Eleanor had been in Dunmore 4 months. She knew this because Caleb had informed her on a Tuesday morning that she'd been their teacher for exactly 112 school days, which he had calculated and then written on the blackboard without being asked, underneath the long division problem she'd assigned. "That's not the assignment," she said. "It's a related calculation," he said. "Division, applied." "Sit down, Caleb." He sat down, but he looked satisfied, which was a look she'd come to recognize as specific to him. The expression of a person who had decided that getting the last word in before compliance still counted as winning. She'd taught children for 6 years in Cincinnati and had never met one quite like him, and she had made her peace with the fact that he was going to be genuinely difficult to manage and genuinely wonderful to watch grow up. Spring was still weeks away, but the quality of the light had changed. It was in the afternoons mostly. The light going longer, the gold in it recovering something it had lost in the deep months of winter. Eleanor noticed it on her walks home from school, the way the main street of Dunmore held the late light at a new angle, the storefronts throwing shadows that were longer and warmer than they'd been in January. Small things. But she'd learned, in the months since Cincinnati, to pay attention to small things. The large things took care of themselves, or they didn't, and you had limited influence either way. The small things were manageable. The town's attention to her situation with Sterling had not diminished. If anything, it had organized itself. The vague gossip of December had, by March, acquired structure. Specific opinions held by specific people that she was becoming aware of through the particular social topography of a small town, which was less like a network of relationships and more like a series of overlapping weather systems, each one generating its own pressure. Franklin Bauer's position was the most legible, politely doubtful, conveyed through small questions with large implications. He asked, one morning over her weekly flour and lamp oil, whether she was finding it difficult to maintain the journey up to the north property given the road conditions in early spring. It was a practical question on its surface. Underneath it was the observation that she was still going, that the town had noticed she was still going, and that Franklin Bauer had an opinion about what that meant. "The road's been fine," Eleanor said. "Cord knows it well." "Cord Latimer." Franklin weighed the flour. "Good kid. Works for Ashford since he was 16. A pause. "Ashford pays his people well. That's one thing people say." "What's the other thing people say?" Eleanor asked, because she was tired of navigating around it. Franklin looked up. He had the grace, at least, to be slightly surprised by the directness. That a woman in your position might find the attention of a wealthy man useful, he said, with the careful precision of someone reciting a thing they want to be able to say they'd stated fairly. She looked at him steadily. A woman in my position, she said, holds a teaching certificate, earns a salary, and lives within her means in a boarding house. She's not shopping for a solution to a problem she doesn't have. She picked up her items. If the people who say that thing would like to revise it, I'm easy to find. She left. She was almost to the end of the block before the anger settled enough for her to think clearly. And what she thought was that Franklin Bauer was not the problem, and anger at him was not useful. The problem was older and larger than him. It was the specific shape that suspicion took around a woman without money and a man with too much of it, the story that wrote itself before anyone had looked at the actual situation. She'd known this story existed. She'd walked into it with her eyes open, or she'd thought she had. Having your eyes open, it turned out, did not make the thing less irritating when it arrived. She told Sterling about it that Saturday, not because she'd planned to, but because he asked, directly, how things were in town, and she had found over the preceding months that she didn't do well with the politely deflecting answer when he asked her a genuine question. He listened. He was sitting across the table from her with the last of the water survey reports, which were genuinely almost finished now, a fact that neither of them had addressed. And he listened with his pen set down and his hands still. Bauer's been skeptical of me since I bought the water rights on the eastern tributary 6 years ago, he said, when she finished. He had a partial claim he thought he could formalize. I got there first. He paused. That's not all of it, but it's some of it. He'd use me to get at you? He wouldn't think of it that way. He'd think he was just being cautious. People are good at believing their own motives are better than they are. He looked at her. Are you sorry you told me? No, she said. I wanted to say it to someone who wouldn't tell me to be careful. You should be careful, he said. Not of Bauer specifically, but the town has a long memory and you have to live in it. So do you. I live above it, he said with a dry gesture toward the mountain. Literally. That makes it easier. Is that why you stay up here? He was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitation of someone avoiding the question, but the pause of someone deciding to answer it honestly. Partly, he said. It started practical. The land is here, the cattle are here. Then at some point the distance became preferable. Because of the story about Smalls? Because of everything that came with the story, he said. Not just that. The way that kind of thing, the suspicion, the noise, the way it makes you into a version of yourself that you don't recognize. You start performing. He picked up the pen and set it down again. I stopped wanting to perform. Eleanor understood this more than she expected to. She'd done her own version of it, the widow story she hadn't corrected, the careful navigation of the boarding house dynamics, the measured pace at which she'd let herself be known in Dunmore, the performance of a manageable version of herself. The difference, she said, is that you removed yourself entirely and I can't. I have 23 students. I know, he said. I'm aware I have the luxury of distance. He said it without defensiveness. I don't think it's a purely good choice. I'm not arguing for it. This was the thing she'd come to value most, she realized, about the afternoons on the mountain. He didn't argue for positions he didn't hold. He stated what was true for him without insisting it was right, and then he listened to what was true for her without trying to resolve it into something neater than it was. She looked at the finished stack of survey reports and thought, we're almost out of reasons. She didn't say it. He didn't say it either, but it was there in the room between them, the way unspoken things were. Not invisible, just unaddressed. The harvest celebration was announced in early September. It was an annual event, Eleanor had learned, the largest social gathering Dunmore put together outside of the 2 or 3 dances that happened through the year. It filled the town hall, which was the biggest interior space available, and it drew people from the outlying farms and ranches as well as the town itself. Food, music, dancing, if you were so inclined, and the particular energy of a community that had made it through another summer and wanted, briefly, to be glad about it. Eleanor had been in Dunmore long enough by then to understand what the harvest celebration meant socially. It was the moment when the year's accumulated standings were made visible. Who stood with whom, who had risen, who had fallen in the community's estimation. All of it played out in the arrangement of bodies in a room, and who asked whom to dance and who stood along the walls.
She hadn't thought particularly about whether Sterling would attend. He came to town rarely. Ruth had mentioned years back, apparently, that he'd attended a harvest celebration once and spent most of the evening being approached by men who wanted something from him, and had not attended one since.
She'd bought a dress for it in late August. New, the first new clothing she'd purchased since arriving in Colorado. A deep green wool that Ruth had helped her choose with the focused efficiency of a woman who took fabric seriously. It was not extravagant. It was simply good, and it fit correctly. And when Eleanor looked at herself in the warped mirror in her boarding house room on the evening of the celebration, she recognized someone she hadn't seen in a while, a woman who was doing all right. The town hall was full when she arrived, warm with bodies and the smell of food, and the first chords from the two-piece band setting up in the corner. She saw Ruth immediately, and Franklin Bauer with his wife on his arm, and Dr. Page near the food table with the expression of a man who had come for the company but was going to spend most of the evening by the food. She saw Maren Halverson near the door talking to a woman Eleanor didn't know, and Caleb across the room wearing a shirt that had clearly been starched and ironed by someone else, and wearing it with the deep resentment of a person subjected to formality against their will. She took a glass of cider and found a place near Ruth and let the evening settle around her. She had been there perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the change in the room. It wasn't dramatic. It was the particular modulation of social noise that happened when something unexpected entered. Not a hush, but a shift. A reorientation of attention. Eleanor turned toward the door. Sterling Ashford had come in. She'd never seen him in town, she realized. She'd seen him on his own mountain, on his own terms, in work clothes and firelight. She had not seen him here. He was wearing a dark coat she didn't recognize, well-made, formal enough for the occasion, though not in the way of someone who'd tried too hard. His hat was in his hand. He stood at the entrance to the town hall with the composed stillness of someone who had walked into a room he'd known would look at him and had decided ahead of time not to be made smaller by it. Several men near the door spoke to him immediately. The particular eager politeness of people addressing someone whose money they wanted access to. He answered them briefly with the courteous economy she recognized and kept moving. He was looking for her. She understood this when his eyes found her across the room and stopped. He moved in her direction with a directness that parted the conversational clusters between them as naturally as anything she'd seen. Not because people stepped aside with deference, but because he simply moved without hesitation and the path opened. Ruth, beside her, had gone very still. He stopped in front of Eleanor. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Ashford." She held her cider glass. "I didn't expect you." "I know." He held her gaze steadily. "I thought it was time." The room was paying attention. Not everyone, not all at once, but the attention was there, the accumulated social awareness of a small community registering an unexpected thing. "You look different," she said, because it was true and she needed to say something that wasn't the larger thing she was thinking. "Same person," he said. "Different coat." "Slightly different," she agreed. The band had started something slow. The dancing hadn't quite begun yet. People were still at the edge of the floor, deciding. "I'm not a good dancer," he said. It came out with the particular deliberateness of something he'd decided to say before he arrived. "I want to be clear about that before I ask." Eleanor looked at him. She was aware of Ruth beside her and the room around her and the architecture of judgment that Dunmore had been building since December. She was aware that what happened in the next 30 seconds would be talked about for a year, and that the version it got talked about in would not be the one she controlled. She was aware of all of it. "I'm not particularly good either," she said. "So that seems fair." He offered his hand. She took it. They walked onto the floor. "Tas." She would remember afterward the quality of the silence as they began to move. Not a complete silence. The music continued, the room continued its noise, but a specific pocket of attention that followed them like weather. She felt it on her back, on the side of her face. She didn't look at the room. He was, as advertised, not a fluid dancer. He was careful and deliberate about it, the way he was careful and deliberate about most physical things. Not graceful, but precise. And he didn't step on her feet, which she appreciated more than elegance would have given her. "They're watching," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Does it bother you?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave most questions. It would have once, he said. 10 years ago, the idea of being looked at like this, like a piece of evidence, it would have made me leave. A pause. I'm still here. Why? He looked at her. Not at the room, not at the band, not at the food table or the watching faces along the walls. At her. Because the thing I'm doing is worth being looked at for, he said. Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened slightly without her fully deciding to do it. They finished the dance. He walked her back to where Ruth was standing, and Ruth's face was doing something complicated that she was managing with varying success, and he thanked Eleanor with a small, formal inclination of his head, and then he was surrounded almost immediately by 3 men from the county land office who had been waiting for their opportunity. Eleanor stood beside Ruth and looked at her cider glass. Well, Ruth said, for the second time in 10 months, in the same tone. Don't, Eleanor said. I wasn't going to say anything. You were. Something, Ruth admitted. Not much. She looked at Eleanor sideways. Are you all right? Eleanor thought about the question seriously. Yes, she said. Then, I don't know what happens next. No, Ruth said. That's usually how it works. Across the room, Sterling was talking to the land office men with the patience of someone who had learned to manage this particular tax on his presence in public spaces. He didn't look across the room at Eleanor. He didn't need to. He'd already done the thing he'd come to do. She understood that. She drank her cider and watched the other dancers and understood it. What came next, in the immediate term, was noise. Not shouting, nothing so overt. Just the particular escalation of the thing that had been building since December, now given the specific fuel of a public act in a room full of witnesses. By Monday morning, Eleanor walked into the general store, and the atmosphere was different in a way that was hard to name but impossible to miss. The slightly heightened attention, the conversations that arrived at a pause when she entered. 3 people said something to her directly. The first was a woman named Dorothy Crane, whose husband ran the livery, who stopped Eleanor on the street Tuesday morning and said, with the brisk directness of someone who had decided to do a thing and was going to do it quickly, I just want to say that I think you're a good teacher, and whatever else is happening is none of my business. Then she walked away before Eleanor could respond, which was perhaps the most efficient expression of support she'd ever received. The second was Franklin Bauer, who was more complicated. He caught her Wednesday evening as she was leaving the school and fell into step beside her with the air of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say. Miss Hart, he began, I want to be straightforward with you. I'd appreciate that, she said. Sterling Ashford is a man who has operated in this county for 15 years on the assumption that his wealth makes the usual rules negotiable, Franklin said. I'm not saying he's a bad man. I'm saying powerful men have a way of reshaping situations around themselves without necessarily meaning to. And I'd hate to see a woman who's built something real here. He gestured vaguely toward the school. I'd hate to see that get complicated. She stopped walking. He stopped too, and had the slight expression of someone who hadn't entirely expected her to stop. Franklin, she said, do you have a specific concern? Something you've seen or know? Or is this a general caution based on a story that has never been substantiated? He opened his mouth. Because if you have specific information, I want to hear it, she said. I mean that. If there's something real that I should know, tell me. But if this is the Hector Small story dressed up as concern for my welfare, I'd ask you to consider whether that's fair to either of us. He closed his mouth. He looked briefly like a man reconsidering the architecture of his own reasoning. I don't have specific information, he said finally. Then I appreciate your concern, she said, and I'll make my own decisions. She started walking again. Good evening, Franklin. The third person was Maren Halverson. She waited until Eleanor came back to the boarding house that Wednesday night, and she was sitting in the front room with her mending, which she set down when Eleanor came in. Sit down a minute, Maren said. Eleanor sat. Maren looked at her with the frank, evaluating expression of someone who had run a boarding house for 20 years and had consequently developed a well-calibrated eye for human situations. She was quiet for a moment in a way that didn't feel like hesitation, more like gathering.
I had a husband, Marin said, who was not well liked in this town. Stubborn man, prone to arguments, not much for making himself easy. People had opinions. She picked up her mending and set it down again. When he died 6 years ago, the opinions became something softer. Because he was gone and I was still here, and people had to decide what they thought of me separate from what they thought of him. Eleanor waited.
I'm telling you this because I want you to know that I know what it is to have people decide they understand your situation better than you do, Marin said. And I want you to know that in my house, your business is yours. A pause. Whatever it is. Eleanor looked at her hands for a moment. Thank you, she said, and it came out with more weight than she'd expected. Marin picked up her mending with finality. The north window in your room has been drafty all week. Remind me, and I'll have it seen to. Eleanor went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a while before she lit the lamp. Outside, the September sky was deep and clear in a way that October would change. This was the last of the good nights before the cold came back, and she could hear through the window a neighbor's dog somewhere, and the distant sound of the creek, and the ordinary accumulated sound of a town settling into evening. 4 months ago, she'd arrived with $42 and a letter from a minister she barely knew. She had a salary now. She had 23 students, one of whom had attempted a 20-mile walk for academic purposes. She had Ruth and Marin, and the particular stubborn thread of a life she was building stitch by stitch out of not much. And she had, on a mountain north of the valley, a man who kept his bookshelves in no discernible order and had come to a harvest celebration for the first time in years and asked her to dance and told her, plainly, that the thing he was doing was worth being looked at for. She didn't know what to do with that. She was beginning to understand, in the way you understood things that were too large to see directly, that not knowing what to do with it was not the same as not wanting it. She lit the lamp. She pulled the borrowed water survey volume, the last one, which she'd taken home by accident 3 weeks ago and hadn't returned, from the bedside table and held it for a moment. The cover was worn at the corners, and the annotations were in 3 inks, and she knew, by now, which ink corresponded to which reading, which year, which stage of his understanding of the thing. She set it on the table. She was going up Saturday. Not because of the report. She'd stopped pretending, at least to herself, that it was because of the report. She went up on Saturday. The October air was sharp in a way that September hadn't been. A cleaner, cold, direct and honest about its intentions. The aspens on the lower slopes had gone gold, and the higher pines held their dark green against the pale sky, and the whole mountain had the look of something that had decided, finally, what it was going to be for the season. Fletcher moved well on the familiar road, and Cord rode beside her mostly in silence, which she appreciated. She wasn't in a mood for conversation. She was in a mood for thinking, which the mountain road was good for. She'd spent the week turning things over. Not obsessively. She had 23 students and a full school week, and Caleb had decided he was now interested in military logistics, which required sources she didn't have and had to improvise around. But in the background of the ordinary days, the question was there, patient and persistent. What she wanted. What was reasonable to want. Whether those were the same thing. She'd arrived in Dunmore with nothing and had built something. Small, maybe, by some measures, but real. The school. The salary. The room at Marin's with the drafty north window that had been fixed, finally, with a competence that surprised her. The reading group and Caleb and the particular daily texture of useful work. She hadn't come to Colorado looking for anything beyond the permission to be somewhere that didn't know what she'd lost. She hadn't come looking for this. That was the thing about it. She hadn't looked for it, and it had arrived anyway, and she was standing in it now trying to figure out whether the fact that she hadn't looked for it made it more trustworthy or less. Sterling was in the yard when she arrived, not waiting for her, just present, coming around from the east side of the main building with a hammer in his hand and a look that said he'd been fixing something. His hair was slightly disordered from the wind, and there was a smear of something dark on his left sleeve, and he looked entirely like himself, which was to say nothing like the version of Sterling Ashford that Dunmore discussed. "Fence post," he said, before she could ask. "Third one this month." "The ground's freezing," she said, dismounting. "Yes." He looked at the hammer briefly, as if he'd forgotten he was holding it, then set it against the porch rail. "Come in. There's coffee." She went in. There was coffee. Mrs. Dolan had clearly decided the survey reports were no longer a viable social fiction and had begun setting out 2 cups without being asked, which Eleanor found equal parts embarrassing and oddly comforting. They sat at the table by the fireplace, which was where they always sat. The room had accumulated a familiarity over the months. She knew the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard near the bookshelves, knew that the lamp on the desk needed its wick trimmed every other visit, knew that Sterling moved the river stone from the corner of the desk to the windowsill when he was in the middle of something he didn't want to lose his place in. Small domestic knowledge, the kind that accrued without intention. He asked about the week. She told him about Caleb and the military logistics, and he listened with the focused attention he gave things, and then said, without preamble, "I have the complete Colorado Territorial Survey Commission reports from 1876 through 1884. They include military supply line documentation from the Southwestern campaigns." She stared at him. "They're in the back room," he said. "I'll find them if you want them." "You've had those this whole time." "Yes. You didn't mention them." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had made a calculation and was not going to pretend otherwise. "No," he said. She should have found this irritating. She found it, instead, genuinely funny, and the laugh that came out of her was surprised and real, and she put her hand over her mouth for a moment. And when she looked back at him, his face had done the thing it occasionally did. The thing that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same room as one. "Sterling," she said, when she'd recovered. "I know," he said. "That's—" She shook her head. "That's a very long way to go." "It worked," he said simply. And then, after a pause, "Up to a point. The shift in the room was immediate. Not dramatic. Nothing crashed. No weather changed. Just the particular shift of a conversation that had been circling something for a long time and had finally stopped circling." Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked at him. "What does that mean?" she asked. Not combatively, just directly. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how to say a thing rather than whether to say it. "It means the survey reports were a reason to ask you to come, and then they became a real thing, and then—" He stopped, looked at the fire. The point of them stopped being what it started as. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "I thought you did." "And yet we both kept pretending." "Yes," he said. She set her coffee cup down. "Why?" He turned back from the fire. "Because I wasn't sure what to do past it," he said. "The reports made sense. They had a shape. What comes after the reports—" He paused. "I don't have as much practice with that." It was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in recent memory. Not eloquent, not smooth, just true, with the particular texture of truth that came from someone who wasn't used to saying it out loud. "Neither do I," she said. He looked at her. "I haven't—" She stopped, started again. "The last year and a half has been primarily about survival," she said. "Practical survival, getting through. I got quite good at that and quite bad at everything else." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I'm not sure I know what I want anymore. I know what I needed when I got here, and I built that, and now there's this. And I don't know exactly what shape it is." "What do you know about it?" he asked. She thought about that seriously, because he asked it seriously. "That it feels different from anything I've had," she said. "That you listen. That you don't make me feel like a version of myself I have to manage." She paused. "That when you walked into that harvest celebration, I understood why you'd come, and it did something to me that I'm still working out." The fire cracked and settled. "I have a question," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is complicated." "All right. What do you want this to be?" He didn't answer immediately. The silence was not evasion. She'd learned the difference over these months between the silence that was avoiding and the silence that was working. This was working. He was looking at the fire with the same expression he'd had the very first morning after the storm, standing by the fireplace with his hat in his hand, and she thought about how much further they'd come from that moment and how much of him she still didn't know. "I want it to be real," he said finally. "I'm less clear on the specific shape." He looked at her. "But I know the difference between what I had before, so the distance, the management of everything at arm's length, and this. And I don't want to go back to that."
She nodded slowly. There are things I need to say, he said. Practical things. Things you should know before. He stopped. I don't want to lay out a ledger. That's not what this is. Then don't, she said. Say what you actually want to say. What he said, over the next hour, was not a speech. It didn't arrive in a single piece. It came in the way conversations came between people who had learned to trust each other's silences as much as their words, in installments, with space between them, with the occasional wrong turn that required backing up. He told her about the brother. The full version, not the shape she'd heard before. The land dispute had been over a parcel near the southern range that their uncle's estate had left ambiguously. Sterling had the stronger legal claim and had pressed it, and the courts had agreed, and his brother Marcus had not spoken to him in 8 years. Not because the law was wrong, Sterling said, but because the way he'd pursued it had been efficient in a way that was also cold, and he hadn't understood. At 28, that being legally right and being a decent brother were two different calculations. Do you regret it? Eleanor asked. I regret how I did it, he said. Not what I decided. I regret that I didn't understand then that a family relationship is not a business negotiation. He looked at the table. I understand it now. I don't know what to do with that understanding because Marcus won't hear from me. Have you tried? Twice. Both letters returned unopened. She nodded. He told her about the war. Not the events of it, but the effect. A particular campaign in the Southwest. A decision made by a senior officer that Sterling had known was wrong, that had cost 3 men their lives. He'd written a report. The report had been buried. The officer had been promoted. Sterling had come back from that service with a particular settled understanding of how institutional power worked that had shaped his decision-making ever since. Not cynically, but without illusions. That's why you manage everything yourself, she said. Partly, he said, and because I'm better at it than trusting it to someone who has a different interest. That's also a lonely way to run things. Yes, he said, for the second time in their acquaintance. It is. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the things she'd been turning over since the boarding house, since the lamp and the water survey report on the bedside table. I need to say something difficult, she said. He looked at her. I'm afraid of becoming decoration, she said. It came out clearly, which was a relief. She'd been worried it would come out messy. I'm afraid that what you want is a person to put at the center of this. She gestured at the room, the lodge, the mountain, and that the wanting is real, but the place it wants to put me is fixed, defined by the shape of your life rather than my own. The silence that followed was different from the working silences. This one had weight. Because of the difference, she said, when he didn't immediately speak. Not just money, all of it. The land, the reach of it. I've built something in the last year that belongs to me. I'm afraid of walking into something that would swallow it. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not hurt, exactly, but something more complicated. As if she'd named a thing he'd been afraid she would name. I know, he said. Do you? I've thought about it, he said. More than I've said. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, looking at her directly. I don't want to collect you, Eleanor. That's not... He stopped, started again. I know what it looks like from the outside. Man with money and land asks a woman who arrived with one bag to step into his life. I know what that story looks like. What does it look like from the inside? She asked. Like the first time in a long time I've wanted something I'm not sure I deserve, he said, and the plainness of it hit her in the sternum. And I'm aware that wanting something doesn't make me entitled to it, which is why I'm telling you this rather than just expecting. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the pines in a long, low sound that wasn't quite silence but was as close to it as the mountain got. What would it look like? She asked. Practically. If you're not decorating me, what are you doing? He was quiet again, but this time it was different. Not the silence of someone working through what to say, but the silence of someone who had thought this through already and was deciding whether to say the whole of it. I have a parcel of land about a mile south of Dunmore, he said. 12 acres along the creek. I bought it 4 years ago for the water access. I've done nothing with it. He looked at the table, then back at her. I'd been thinking, before I say this, I want you to know that this is not a trade. This is not me buying something. I'm saying it because it's the honest version of what I want. Say it, she said.
I'd been thinking about building there, he said. Not a lodge, not this. He gestured at the large room around them. Something closer to town, something that was mine and also reachable by ordinary life. He paused. I'd been thinking that if there were a way to do this, what we've been building up here, that kept you in your work, in the town, in the things you've made, without asking you to give any of that up. You'd want to try, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The fire burned. Outside, a horse moved somewhere in the yard, the soft percussion of hooves on frozen ground. I haven't said yes to anything, she said. I know, he said. I'm not asking for yes yet. I'm asking for whether it's worth saying more. She looked at him across the table, this man who had ridden out of a blizzard and given her his glove and had 12 years of water survey reports annotated in 3 inks, and a brother who returned his letters unopened, and a story about him that the town had maintained for a decade out of habit and envy. Who had come to a harvest celebration for the first time in years because he'd decided it was worth being seen. Who had just told her that for the first time in a long time, he wanted something he wasn't sure he deserved. Yes, she said. It's worth saying more. She rode back to Dunmore in the early afternoon with the October light long and gold across the valley, and she sat with what the morning had been the whole way down the mountain, not processing it into conclusions. She wasn't ready for that. Just sitting with it, the way you sat with something large until your eyes adjusted enough to see its real shape. What she had, she thought, was not certainty. She was not a person who'd arrived at certainty about much of anything in the last 2 years, and she was not going to pretend she had it now. What she had was something more useful, information. She knew more of who he was than she'd known 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago. She knew the parts he wasn't proud of, which were the most useful parts to know. She knew he was capable of the kind of honesty that cost something. And she knew, with the plain, undramatic clarity of a person who had learned to trust her own reading of situations, that she wanted to see where this went. The town appeared below as Fletcher rounded the last bend, smoke rising from the familiar chimneys, the main street putting out its late afternoon light. She'd been gone 4 hours, and she had 23 students to prepare for Monday, and a north window that no longer drafted, and a half-read history volume on her bedside table, and a life that was hers, entirely hers, in all its small and functional reality. It was still hers. She was not giving it away. That was what she'd needed to know going up the mountain, and it was what she'd come back with. The assurance from the man himself that he understood the difference between a partner and a possession. Whether that understanding would hold under the weight of actual circumstances was not something she could know yet. But she'd asked the hard question, and he'd answered it without flinching and without making it easy on himself. And she'd learned, in the last year, to weigh that kind of honesty correctly. Cord pulled up in front of the boarding house and took Fletcher's reins with his usual efficient silence, and Eleanor stepped down and thanked him, and stood for a moment on the main street of Dunmore, watching the ordinary afternoon traffic of the town move around her. Franklin Bauer was locking up the general store across the street. He saw her and gave a small civil nod. She nodded back. Whatever he thought, she thought. Let him think it. She went inside. Marin was at the kitchen table with her accounts, her reading glasses low, her pencil moving in the precise and unhurried way she did everything. She looked up when Eleanor came in, registered something in Eleanor's face that she chose not to comment on, and said, "There's stew if you're hungry." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I am." She hung her coat, sat down at the kitchen table, and accepted the bowl that Marin set in front of her. The kitchen was warm. The stew was the plain, filling kind that Marin made without embellishment and without apology. And it tasted, as it always did, exactly like what it was. Eleanor ate, and did not think too hard about anything, and let the ordinary warmth of the kitchen do what it could. She was tired. The good kind of tired. The kind that came from a day in which something real had happened. She finished the stew and washed her bowl and said goodnight to Marin and went upstairs. The water survey report was still on the bedside table. She picked it up and looked at the 3-ink annotations for a moment, and then she set it down again. She didn't need to read it. She'd read it. She knew what was in it. She knew now more than that. She blew out the lamp and lay back on the quilted bed in the dark, and listened to the mountain wind come off the northern face and press itself against the windows with its particular persistence, the way it always did when the season was changing, looking for the gaps in things and not finding them. Outside, the stars were doing what stars did up here, which was to be present in a way that the city version of her had not understood was possible, dense and unapologetic and indifferent to whether anyone was looking. She was looking. She lay there for a while, just looking. November came back around and Eleanor stood it without flinching. A year ago, she had stepped off a train in Dunmore with $42 and a borrowed recommendation and the specific exhaustion of someone who had been running long enough that stopping felt dangerous. She had not marked the anniversary on any calendar. She'd noticed it the way you noticed weather, not as an event, but as a condition, something that was simply true about the day when she woke up on a Thursday morning and lay in the familiar dark of her room and understood, before she'd fully thought it through, that she was not the same person who had arrived. The school was her first evidence of this. She walked in that Thursday morning and looked at the 23 faces arranged in their rows. Caleb at his desk with his inevitable pre-class argument already in preparation, 2 girls in the front row working through a reading problem they'd set themselves, a boy named Henry in the back who came from a farm 8 miles out and who had been barely literate in January and was now reading full chapters without assistance. And she felt something that was not quite pride and not quite satisfaction, but something between them, something more honest than either. She had built this. Out of a cold room and a worn blackboard and 34 skeptical eyes on a November morning. She'd built it the same way she'd built everything in the last year, by showing up, by being consistent, by refusing to let the hard days determine the permanent shape of things. That was the thing about grief she'd come to understand. Not that it ended. It didn't, not completely. Thomas was still in the morning sometimes, in the particular quality of a winter light that had been his favorite, and her mother was in small domestic moments, the smell of a particular soap, the sound of rain on a window. They were present the way the dead remained present, which was to say sideways, in the peripheral, rarely head-on. She'd learned to let them be there without letting them be the whole of her attention. You didn't recover from loss. You built around it until the building was real enough to hold. Sterling had said something to her back in February, sitting by the fireplace with the tea gone cold. That was for you as much as for him. He'd meant the 6 days beside Thomas's bed. And he'd been right, and she'd known it was right. And what she hadn't said then was that understanding why she'd done it didn't make it less true or less important. You could know the human mechanics of a thing and still honor the thing itself. She'd been thinking about that more lately, about what it meant to understand yourself clearly and still choose the harder thing, about the difference between wisdom and coldness. The situation with Sterling had not resolved itself into anything simple in the week since October, which she had expected and had told herself to be patient about. They were not patient people, either of them, in the way of people who dealt primarily in facts and decisions, but they had both learned, through the particular education of their respective lives, that certain things could not be forced into their final shape before they were ready. He came to town 3 times in November, not for the harvest celebration, not for any social reason, once for a meeting with the county assessor about the eastern water rights, once to consult with Dr. Page about one of his ranch hands who'd broken an arm badly enough to need the doctor's attention rather than the lodge's, and once with no stated reason that she was aware of, which resulted in him appearing at the school door at 3:30 on a Tuesday when the students had gone home and Eleanor was cleaning the blackboard. She heard the door and turned. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, which she'd come to understand as a specific posture. The hat in the hand was Sterling, without his official position, Sterling making himself slightly smaller than the room. "I was in town," he said. "I can see that," she said. He came in. He looked at the rows of small desks with the expression of someone trying to place himself in the context of a space. He picked up a reader from the nearest desk and looked at it briefly, then set it back. "Do you ever find it strange?" he said. "Teaching children who are going to grow up here and never leave, mostly, same valley, same mountains?" "Some of them will leave," she said. "Caleb will leave," he said with a certainty that surprised her. "Yes," she agreed. "Caleb will leave and he'll argue about everything he finds when he gets there, and whoever has to teach him next will either love him or lose their mind." Something moved across Sterling's face that was, she recognized it now, after enough months of learning his face, genuine warmth. The contained kind. The kind he didn't distribute freely, which made it mean more when it appeared. "I did something this week," he said. I want to tell you before you hear it from anyone else. She set down her blackboard eraser and looked at him. I wrote to Marcus, he said. She was quiet.
Not to relitigate the land claim, not to apologize in a way that was really just asking for something. He looked at the hat in his hands. I told him I handled it wrong. The how of it, not the what. I told him I understood if he didn't want to respond. He paused. And then I told him what's been happening here. He stopped. With you. Because it seemed wrong to have a significant development in my life, and the only person I haven't told is my brother. Eleanor felt something in her chest that required a moment to identify. It wasn't sentiment exactly, it was recognition. The recognition of watching someone do a thing that cost them something for no strategic reason, just because it was right. Did you send it? She asked. Yesterday, he said. Do you think he'll respond? No, Sterling said, but I think I needed to say it regardless, whether it changes anything for him. He looked up at her. I've been thinking about what you said in October, about the difference between understanding something and doing something with the understanding. She hadn't said that exactly. She'd thought it. She'd thought it sitting in this room on a Thursday morning, and she hadn't said it to him yet. I didn't say that to you, she said. He looked at her. Then he looked faintly, briefly, startled. The expression of a man who had just realized he'd been carrying on a conversation internally that he'd assumed was external. No, he said. You didn't. The room was quiet for a moment. I've been talking to you when you're not there, he said, with the directness of someone who had decided that the embarrassing true thing was better than the dignified untrue one. For a while now. What do I say? She asked. When you're talking to me when I'm not there. He thought about it. You ask good questions, he said. You don't let me get away with the comfortable version. She looked at him standing in her school with his hat in his hand and 8 years of silence toward his brother and a letter sent yesterday and the same face he'd had in the blizzard, the face that assessed, decided, acted. And she thought about all the versions of a person you had to see before you understood what they were actually made of. The crisis version and the ordinary version and the version at 3 a.m. when no one was looking. I want to see the land, she said. He looked up. The parcel south of town, she said. I want to see it. They walked to it on a Saturday in late November, which was not a riding weather day. A gray sky and the particular cold that came before serious snow, the ground frozen and the dead grass standing in rigid brown rows. Sterling had told Cord to stay with the horses at the trailhead, and they'd walk the last quarter mile on foot, which Eleanor thought was probably deliberate on his part. You saw land differently when you walked it. The parcel was along the creek where it bent east, 12 acres of flat ground with a stand of cottonwoods along the water and the mountain visible to the north, Dunmore's church steeple just barely discernible to the south in the gray air. The land itself was unremarkable in the specific, honest way of Colorado bottomland. Not dramatic, not beautiful in any postcard sense, just solid and present and enduring. She stood in the middle of it and looked around. He stood a few feet away and said nothing, which was right. This was her decision to make, and he seemed to understand that the way he understood most things, completely, without requiring it to be explained. It's close enough to walk to school, she said. 8 minutes, he said. I walked it. She looked at him. When did you walk it? September, he said. The week after the harvest celebration. She turned back to the land. The creek was running fast and dark between its frozen banks, and the cottonwoods were bare now, their white branches making a clean architecture against the gray sky. In spring they would leaf out, and in summer they would be loud with birds, and in fall they would go gold the way aspens went gold, sudden and complete. I need to keep teaching, she said. I know. Not as a concession, as a condition, not because I need permission to, but because I'm telling you clearly what I need. I understand the difference, he said. The school needs a proper library, she said. An actual one, not a closet with crates. I've been writing to the county board about it since February and getting politely redirected. He was quiet for a moment. I have some standing with the county board, he said carefully. If you wanted me to, not for me, she said. For Caleb and Henry and the 21 other children who have to read whatever I can find. Not as a favor to me.
as a reasonable public investment in the county's educational infrastructure, he said. Yes. I can make that argument, he said. She looked at him, and he looked back at her. And the argument was done, and the conversation was something else now, something that had been building for a year through water survey reports, and honest questions, and a dance in a crowded room, and a letter sent to a brother who might not open it. Sterling, she said. Yes. I'm not going to be afraid of this anymore, she said. It came out quietly, not as a declaration, but as a decision made privately that she was choosing to say out loud. I was afraid of becoming something decorative in your life. I was afraid of losing what I've built here. I've spent enough time being afraid of things that I'm going to lose anyway if I keep being afraid of them. She paused. I want to try. With open eyes, and both of us saying the honest thing when there's a hard thing to say. He crossed the frozen ground between them, not quickly, and when he reached her, he stopped with a foot of distance between them and looked at her with the expression she'd seen in only a few times. The expression underneath the composed surface, where Sterling Ashford was just a person who had been alone for a long time and had decided, finally, to stop finding reasons to stay that way. I can do that, he said. His voice was different, lower, less even. I know you can, she said. That's why I'm saying yes. He reached out and took her hand, the same hand he'd given his glove to in the blizzard a year ago, and held it. And they stood there on 12 acres of unremarkable Colorado bottomland in the cold November air, with the creek running beside them and the mountains above them, not saying anything, because there wasn't anything left to say, that the silence wasn't already saying better. Oh. The winter passed, and with it the last of the town's organized suspicion. It didn't happen in one moment. That was the thing about a community's opinion. It didn't reverse itself in a single dramatic pivot. It eroded, the way banks eroded along a creek, slowly, consistently, until one day you looked, and the shape was different from what it had been without anyone having witnessed the exact moment of change. What eroded it was not the engagement, which Sterling announced to Eleanor in January in the plainest possible terms. A conversation at the kitchen table in the lodge. No ceremony, just, I'd like to marry you, if you're willing, and I'd like to do it before spring because I'm done with the arrangement where you're 4 miles away and I'm up a mountain. She'd said yes with the same lack of ceremony, which seemed exactly right for both of them. What eroded it was accumulation. The library, Sterling's case to the county board, made in February with the full weight of his standing and not a single mention of Eleanor's name, resulting in an allocation of funds that had Ruth Calder practically vibrating with suppressed satisfaction when she told Eleanor about it. The road improvements on the South Trail, which benefited every farm and ranch in the Northern Valley, and which Sterling funded without announcement, discovered only when the county surveyor mentioned it at a town council meeting. The morning in March, when one of Cord's younger brothers showed up at the school with a note saying his family's farm had been hit by a late freeze and his father couldn't bring the children to school, and by the following day Sterling had arranged temporary housing for the family at the lodge's outbuildings until the damage was assessed, not publicly, not with any expectation of acknowledgement. These things moved through Dunmore the way truth moved through a small town, slowly and with resistance, but thoroughly, until even the people who had held their skepticism longest found it becoming difficult to sustain. Franklin Bauer said nothing directly to Eleanor about it. But in April, when she came in for her weekly flour and lamp oil, he set a book on the counter beside her items, a history of Colorado territorial water rights that he'd ordered through a distributor and which had no reason to be in a general store's inventory. I thought you might find this interesting, he said, without meeting her eyes. For the school. She looked at it. Thank you, Franklin, she said. He nodded with the efficiency of a man closing a transaction he'd been mentally running for 6 months. She took the book. The wedding was in May. Eleanor had thought she didn't care particularly about the ceremony. She'd told Sterling in January that she wanted something simple, something that didn't ask the town to perform an emotion it hadn't finished deciding it felt. He'd agreed, because he agreed with most things that made practical sense, and they'd planned it accordingly. The town hall, a Saturday afternoon, Maren Halverson and Ruth Calder and Dr. Page and a handful of others. What she hadn't anticipated was the town deciding otherwise on its own. It arrived in increments. Ruth appeared 2 weeks before with fabric and opinions. Marin began producing food from her kitchen in quantities that exceeded any reasonable interpretation of a small ceremony. Dorothy Crane, whose husband ran the livery, organized the decorating of the town hall with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting for a suitable project. Children from the school arrived the morning of, with wildflowers from the lower meadows, Caleb among them, who had clearly been compelled by someone and was managing it with reasonable grace, his shirt starched again, and his expression that of a person who had decided to participate under protest but was going to do it properly. Eleanor stood in Marin's front room on the morning of the wedding in her dress. The green one, not new now, but altered by Ruth to be exactly what it needed to be, and looked out the window at the main street of Dunmore where people were moving toward the town hall with the particular energy of a community that had decided something was worth showing up for. And she thought about what it meant. Not for her and Sterling specifically, for all of it, for the town and the year and the shape that things had taken. People had been wrong about Sterling. Some of them had known they were wrong and maintained it anyway because the story was easier than the truth. Some of them had genuinely believed it because the distance he'd kept had let the story fill the space where knowledge should have been. And some of them, the Franklins of the town, had used the story for their own purposes while telling themselves they were being careful. None of it had been unique to him or to her or to Dunmore. It was just the ordinary human machinery of judgment and assumption and the way communities managed uncertainty about people they didn't fully know. The machinery had been running on them for a year, and now it was shifting, and the shift was not because anyone had made a speech or won an argument. It was because Sterling had kept showing up, quietly, consistently, without making a performance of his own rehabilitation. And the distance had slowly become less comfortable than the truth. She thought about what she'd learned from watching him do that. She'd arrived in Colorado running from grief and carrying the specific damage of a person who had been making themselves smaller for so long that the smallness had started to feel like safety. She'd built something here, real and hers. And then she'd been asked to decide whether building something shared required giving up what was already built. And the answer, which had taken her months to arrive at, and which she was still, in certain moments, actively choosing, was no. The two things were not in competition. What she'd made for herself was not diminished by what she was making with someone else. If anything, it was the foundation. That was the thing no one had said to her in Cincinnati, in all those years of ordinary life. That love was not a subtraction, that you didn't arrive at it by giving yourself away, but by being fully what you were and finding someone who wanted that, specifically, without alteration. Marin appeared in the doorway with the particular expression she wore when she had something to say and had been deciding for 3 minutes whether to say it. "You look fine," Marin said. "Thank you. I want to say something." "Say it." Marin was quiet for a moment. "When my husband died," she said, "people expected me to be relieved. He was difficult, like I told you. They thought I'd been contained by it. And I was angry at them for thinking that, because they hadn't seen what was real between us under all the difficulty." She paused. "I'm not comparing your situation. I'm saying that people see the surface of things and make their calculations. And most of the time, they're working with about a third of the information they'd need to be right." She looked at Eleanor directly. "You've made a good choice. I say that as someone who has watched both of you carefully and has an accurate eye." Eleanor looked at her. "That's the best thing anyone has said to me today," she said. Marin made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite dismissal. "Go get married," she said. "The food's going to be cold if we wait much longer." The ceremony was not long. The justice of the peace was a practical man named Aldrich, who had married perhaps 40 couples in his tenure and had arrived at an efficient and reasonably dignified version of the proceedings. Sterling stood at the front of the town hall in a dark coat that was neither the formal harvest celebration version nor the work clothes of the mountain, something in between, which seemed right. He looked, Eleanor thought as she walked toward him through the crowded room, exactly like himself. No performance, no ceremony layered on top of the person. Just the person, standing there with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her. She reached him. "Hello?" he said quietly. "Hello," she said. Aldrich cleared his throat. They said what needed to be said. Sterling's voice was steady throughout,
which she'd expected, though she noticed his jaw tighten once, not with doubt, she thought, but with the particular emotion of a person for whom this moment was larger than its external form. She'd learned to read his containments by now. She knew the difference between the ones that were closed and the ones that were full. When it was done, the room did something she hadn't quite prepared for. It made noise. Not polite applause, but actual, spontaneous noise. Ruth starting it, and the rest following, and Caleb in the third row letting out a sound that was technically a cheer, but which he'd later describe, if asked, as a general expression of academic satisfaction at a situation resolving correctly. Sterling looked briefly at the room with the expression of a man who had not expected this volume of approval and was not entirely sure what to do with it. Then he looked at Eleanor, and she was already looking at him, and something in his face settled. "They're louder than I expected," he said, low enough for only her to hear. "They've been waiting a year," she said. "So have I," he said. "What?" "They built the house on the south parcel over the summer, not the way the lodge had been built, not with the scale and permanence of money establishing itself in a place, but practically, with a builder from town named Goss who had strong opinions about foundations and no patience for ornament. It was a good house, not a large one. It sat along the creek with the cottonwoods to the east and the mountain visible to the north, and Dunmore reachable in 8 minutes on foot, exactly as measured. Eleanor taught the fall term from it. She walked the 8 minutes every morning and 8 minutes back every evening, and the library was under construction at the school. A real room off the main hall, with shelves being built by the same Goss who had built their house and who had similarly strong opinions about shelf load-bearing capacity. Caleb was 12 now, and read faster than she could supply him with material, and had recently written a letter on his own initiative to a university in Denver asking about their admission requirements, which Eleanor had found on her desk one morning with a note that said, "I wanted to know if this was possible. Is it?" She'd written back, "Yes, let's find out how." Sterling got a letter from Marcus in October. It was short, 2 paragraphs, neutral in tone, neither forgiving nor condemning. It acknowledged the letter Sterling had sent the previous November. It said that Marcus was in good health and still on his ranch near Pueblo. It said nothing about the land claim or the 8 years. Sterling read it twice and then set it on the desk and looked at it for a while. "It's something," Eleanor said. "It's something," he agreed. "Are you going to write back?" "Yes," he said, "but not quickly. I don't want to press it." "No," she said. "Don't press it." She went back to the student essays she was marking, and he went back to whatever he'd been working on, and the house was quiet in the way it was quiet in the evenings. Not empty quiet, but the shared quiet of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them with noise. Outside, the fall had gone gold, and then brown, and the first serious cold was coming off the mountain the way it always did, patient and comprehensive. The creek was running lower than August, the cottonwood leaves gone or going, the whole landscape doing its annual reckoning with what it was. A year ago, Eleanor had stood on this land in the November cold and looked at the mountains and said yes to a question that had no guaranteed answer. She had said it knowing it could go wrong, knowing she didn't have complete information, knowing that certainty was a thing she'd stopped expecting from a life that had shown her, repeatedly, how quickly the certain things dissolved. What she'd had was evidence, not proof. Evidence. The sustained, accumulating kind. The kind that built itself out of small, consistent actions rather than large declarations. She had that still. More of it now. She looked up from the essays at Sterling across the room, bent over his papers with the river stone at the corner of his desk holding his place, and he didn't look up, just said without raising his eyes, "You're looking at me." "I know," she said. "Is there something?" "No," she said. "Nothing." He looked up then, and across the room their eyes met in the way they did sometimes. No particular weight to it, no drama, just the simple mutual recognition of 2 people who had found something they hadn't been looking for and had been honest enough with themselves to take it seriously. He went back to his papers. She went back to her essays. The mountain wind came off the north face and moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, the way it had moved through them for 100 years before either of them arrived and would move through them for 100 years after. Indifferent and constant and quietly magnificent. Inside the house, the fire burned. Outside, the stars came out over the mountains the way they always did up here.
More of them than made sense, more than the eye knew what to do with, dense and uncompromising and absolutely present. Eleanor did not look at them tonight. She was already where she needed to be.